All right. Well, good evening. Hey, ladies and
Hello
gentlemen
there.
out there.
How are you doing tonight, Christopher?
Very well. How are you doing, Ron?
I'm doing excellent on our inaugural show here.
It is indeed. I know. I don't know. We've got a couple of people watching. I don't know if that just represents us for the sole watchers here, but anybody that's out there, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural episode of Monday Night Monsters. And this evening we're going to be talking a little bit about the legends, the folklore, and all of the heritage behind something that's very near and dear to my heart. And I know, Ron, that it's a favorite topic of yours as well, and that is werewolves and all of the various permutations thereof.
Absolutely. As a kid, I think that was one of the first monsters that actually frightened me and fascinated me at the same time. It's one of those kind of dichotomous monsters because you're instantly drawn to it because it reminds you so much of a human being, but then you're completely repulsed and disgusted by it as well. And I think as we start this program, we start looking at the lineage in which these creatures grew out of. We can kind of see how that all kind of came together.
And I'm right there with you. It's a very childhood thing. When I was probably, I think I might have been 7 or 8 years old, and a wildlife sanctuary near where I lived. I grew up in a very rural area, and they would have a Halloween party every year. And I'm really dating myself with this one, but they had an old movie projector in their sort of common room, and they showed old black and white 8mm films of the classic Universal monsters. And this one Halloween, they showed Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and it just electrified me. I thought that it was wonderful, and I think at the time I certainly had no idea, but that's a movie that in a lot of ways is hugely significant to modern werewolf lore, because it was that movie that introduced some of the tropes that became well-known aspects of werewolf folklore going forward, including the first time that a full moon was the catalyst for a werewolf to change. So again, a huge part. Hi, Mary Beth. Hello, welcome aboard tonight.
So people are coming. That's good. It's good to know that it's good to know that everything is working, isn't it, Christopher? See, that was my thing. I thought maybe we were just talking to ourselves and people are wondering why the show's not coming on.
Hey, you know what? I'm used to talking to myself. I do it when I'm home alone all the time. So tonight wouldn't have been any different. But hopefully we'll get a couple of people in here watching. We'll say we've got a few nice folks. And yes, of course, please post your questions and comments in the comments section. And we can't promise to answer every single question, but we'll do our best to get to them as we go through.
So as we start, Christopher, let me ask you, where would we start whenever we're discussing the legends and lore of the werewolf? Like, at what point in history or prehistory do you want to begin this little trek as we start looking for footprints?
Well, the real origins to me of the werewolf folklore go back to the absolute earliest prehistory of man. Some of the very first cave art going back 60,000 years, 40,000 years BC depict images. In fact, I've got some stuff up here, depict images such as human beings in the shape of animals. And we believe that this was some of the earliest form of magical belief, the idea of taking on the characteristics of animals in order to hunt more successfully. And so the idea of shape-shifting or taking on the form of animals has been with us probably since we had the ability to write or the ability to perceive that animals were more successful hunters than we were.
Right. And so, and I feel the exact same way. I think the idea of sympathetic magic, becoming the animal in which you wanted to hunt in order to, find out how to pursue it and how to all that other stuff comes into play. But let's talk a little bit about the shamanic tradition that's behind that as well too. Is this something that was reserved for the common folk, or was this something made for somebody that was special, somebody that was sectioned out from the whole?
Shamanism really, I think, began with the common folk because in the probably the earliest forms of magic, there are two basic kinds of magic, and I'm glad you brought this up. You have sympathetic magic and you have imitative magic. These are the two classes of early shamanic magic. Sympathetic magic is taking an item like a wolf's claw or a bear's tooth and using it to try to imbue yourself with the power of that creature, believing that a thing that came from that creature, a lock of its fur, a claw, a bone, has a magical connection to that creature. And then there's imitative magic, where you actually would place a wolf skin or a bear skin over your body, a cheetah skin, and attempt to act out and physically become that creature. But in the beginning, I don't think that they had holy men or priests or shamans in the way we would understand it as their civilizations developed later on. I think that the hunting class, the hunters among the tribe, would be the ones that did this. But this is an interesting thing that we're probably going to get into a little bit later on, is that shape shifting in those early days appears to have primarily been part of the male magical system, because the males were the ones who could leave the immediate area of the settlement and go hunting, where women generally tended, and this is where a lot of gender roles ended up coming into play in society, is that because women cared for the children who you couldn't safely take on a hunt, the women tended to stay behind and became more involved with what you'd call herbalism and hedge magic, and the men became the hunters. And so shape-shifting magic at that time in history tended to be more of a male mystery. But there wasn't yet a shaman class, and I think that didn't start to come in until a bit later, as civilizations grew and they started to form social structures and hierarchies.
Right, as long as you have that stratification. Because whenever I think of the great sorcerer in that Lascaux, in that particular
Yeah,
campaign, France, yeah, it appears that as somebody's taking on the form of a deer, some sort of antlered creature. But like you suggested at the very beginning, and you even showed in those photographs, we have this tradition not only isolated to a small area of Europe. This is in North America. This is in China. This is in Africa. Right? This is something that is really part of who we are. And if we would go a little bit deeper, we can say that this is actually part of our collective unconscious as human beings.
Oh, I very much think so. And the truth is that although the focus of our topic today is going to be werewolves, and that's where a lot of this conversation is going to carry us, the truth is that the dominant predatory or dominant animal in any region of the world tended to be the creature that was the focus of much of their shape-shifting magic. If you were in Asian countries, it was often things like big cats. If you were in African countries, there were were-elephants, were-jaguars,
We're
things like that,
Yeah.
of course. And so the dominant creatures of the region are going to be the ones that feature most prominently in their shape-shifting
Right.
magic.
But wolves are special, aren't they? Because that is where we get our dog from. There's some special tie between human beings and the canid. There's some sort of intrinsical connection there that is with us to this very day. And a lot of my theory about the idea of werewolves begins with the idea that we had to almost imitate their actions and their way of communicating in order to hunt, in order to make our stand in a very early Pleistocene world.
It's I apologize. I actually was just reading
Oh, no, no, no,
on the
no.
screen, so I got knocked off track a little bit there. But yes, absolutely. The thing is that the canid fascinate or our fascination with canids, I think dates back again, a
Right.
millennia, in to the point where wild wolves began to lurk around human settlements. Now, of
Mhm.
course, obviously, this tended to be in more northern climates and a little bit more focused in the western region. But that's where we're going to be focusing today. I don't claim to be a real specialist on Asian or African culture, but even in Africa, canids certainly were a big part of the
Mhm.
hunting, sort of the hunting ecosystem. And we'd formed these bonds, and these bonds, I think we felt that we were closer to wolves and other canids than were to other kinds of creatures, the way they banded and formed family units. And because of that, we could identify with them. And
Right.
as that bond grew, we had this love and hate relationship. And that's something that I think we're going to address a lot tonight, is the difference between our fear of wolves and
Mhm.
creatures like them and our attraction to them. And the fact that the clash of those two things makes werewolves such a complex and very rich topic.
Right.
They're both the thing we fear most and the thing we most desire to be, and that's not always two different things. Often the thing we are most jealous of, we have a love-hate relationship with.
See, and that's a great point as well too, because the very wolf from which our dogs came from, they were also predatory on the human species as well, right? I mean,
Yes,
it was
absolutely.
something to admire, but it was also something to fear, because you can imagine sitting around a campfire, and that glow is the only safety with everybody huddled around it. And then you hear that howl at night, that howl that kind of sends shivers down your spine, because you know that there is something out there that is working on some sort of intelligence, almost like you have, because it seems to be very cooperative hunting and a communicative hunting. But you know that there's something out there that can now prey upon you, right? You're not the apex predator at that point.
And to be honest, although I think in human history we have tended to imagine ourselves to be the pinnacle of evolution, that makes us particularly antagonistic to any
Mm,
creature which we feel can prey upon us. We
mm,
want to be the top of the food chain, but the truth is we've never truly been the top of the food chain. We've just managed to clear out a space where we don't let these apex predators into our spaces. The reason
right.
why in this country and in other parts of the world we've driven wolves to the point of near extinction is because the idea of a creature that can prey upon us is offensive to us as a species that likes to see ourselves as superior.
That's
Um,
right.
but what I also think is fascinating is the primal, both fear and absolute, it's almost arousal that we get when we interact with or hear the howl of a wolf. The howl of a wolf to most people in the Western hemisphere is one of the most primal, the most basic evocations of wildness. And there are a lot of people. It's a very attractive notion to connect with wildness. It's something that in modern civilization, as we sort of closed ourselves in with steel and glass and the internet and roads and cars, we've lost our connection to the wild, and that's something that people have longed for and still do. And that's going to play in a lot to, I think, the spirituality of both the shamanism of 40,000 years ago, and even some modern spirituality and shamanism that tends to surface today.
Yeah, very good point. And as Chris says, as Jeff says, Chris said you feel that there was a connection in learning to hunt in packs by watching wolves. Now, in my opinion, I certainly think that there has been. In a book that I wrote on werewolves called "On Dogman: Tracking the Werewolf Through History," that was one of the points that I made in a very early chapter. That the idea of who we are as human beings came from imitating the animals around us and how they hunted necessarily, and also the idea of following around wolves to scavenge for prey as well too. But what are your feelings upon that? Do you think that we do have some sort of do we owe some sort of debt of gratitude, should we say, to wolves because of them? Have we learned to hunt by watching them?
Jeff Hilton, you just asked a great question right along those lines. Do we think we felt that connection due to us learning to hunt in packs by watching them? And I think that maybe that is true. I think that again, these early attempts at shape shifting, humans, every species on Earth has a gift. Every species on Earth has something that it's known for, some special power. And humans' power, and one of the things that does make us an extraordinary species, is the ability to imagine things. And that's
Mm,
something that, as far as we can tell, doesn't really seem to exist outside of humans in the animal kingdom. And we were able to imagine ourselves in the form of a wolf, in the form of a jaguar. And so by putting these skins over our bodies, fashioning claws from bone or metal, dancing, and in many cases in shamanic tradition, consuming things like mushrooms or roots or plants that had hallucinogenic properties, you literally became these animals, and you would imitate them. And by imitating them, you could take on the abilities that you didn't have in your ordinary waking daylight life, and basically become a wolf, hunt in packs, howl, run, use your senses to a degree that seemed impossible in an ordinary human. And so I think not only did we learn to hunt this way, but I also think that we became better hunters by imitating these predatory creatures.
And we certainly became better warriors, as you're pointing out as well, too.
Absolutely.
That idea. So as we go from the shamanic tradition, as we come from a hunter-gatherer tradition, and then we start putting up walls and we start separating ourselves, and all of a sudden nature becomes the other rather than us being a part of it. Why does the werewolf still follow us? Why is it still there? Why do those howls still mean something to us, even though we have barricaded ourselves from that world?
I don't think we've ever given up the idea that we have a wildness within us. And you can find cults that date back to Greek and Roman times that still, even, as cities were growing up around them, they had, we think about, Roman and Greek civilization as being so distant from us. But in many ways, they created the standard of civilization that we still live by today. They created the first roads, the first aqueducts, apartment buildings, and things like that. They had holidays, they had calendars, all these things that we still maintain to this day. We even use their numeric systems. But even those people held on to this concept of wildness as something that you didn't want to lose. And on Mount Lycaon in Greece, tens of thousands of years ago, there was a cult. And something that people don't always realize in mythology is that the word Zeus, as the king of the ancient Greek gods, was not a single entity. Zeus didn't mean one guy. Zeus meant God. It meant God much the same way as when we say God. God isn't the name of the deity. It's a description of what that deity is. And there were various forms of Zeus depending on the region, depending on the concept or the spirituality of this group. So Lycaeus Zeus, or Zeus Lycaean, was wolfish Zeus. He was a form of Zeus that was a god of forests, a god of wildness, and there were cults dedicated to him. And every 7 years, these cults would hold human sacrifice rituals. Now, that's a very grim thought, but this is a part of what they believed, is that by consuming the flesh of one of their own members, that they would take on this wolfish aspect. And in doing so, according to old legend, some members of the congregation would transform into wolves and become wolves for the next 7 years, only being able to return to human form at the next gathering of the cult 7 years later. And by this cycle, they believed that every 7 years or so, they could be restored to their human form and kind of return to their lives. And this cult, it grew into a lot of different myths. In fact, the name Lycaeus or Lycaon has been transformed into another old Greek myth, which gives us the name lycanthropy. Lycanthropy being the medical term that is used to describe werewolfism. So we actually refer to werewolves as lycanthropes because of King Lycaon. The King Lycaon myth suggests that 30 or 40,000 years ago, there was an ancient Greek king called Lycaon, and Lycaon, as often the gods walked among men back then, invited Zeus to have dinner with him. And so he gathered all of his noble friends, and he had the god Zeus there. But Lycaon didn't necessarily believe that Zeus was as powerful as he was cracked up to be. He thought, if you're a god, you know everything. And so Lycaon, who was supposedly already a very evil man, had his own son killed and cooked and served him at that dinner. Now, the moment that Zeus took a look at this, he knew that this was a human being. He immediately realized this, and he told King Lycaon that this dreadful act of cruelty proves that you're no better than a wolf. And so he cursed Lycaon and all of his children to take the form of wolves, and then restored Lycaon's son who'd been murdered back to life, but cursed the rest of them. They say that that's the origin of lycanthropy. So that was a point at which civilization was already growing up, and we already had these enormously complicated myths to describe the sort of I probably should have brought this up. Sorry, folks, this is our first broadcast, and I'm just getting used to some of our systems here. But here's a wonderful painting from the 15th century of Zeus transforming King Lycaon into a wolf.
Right. So what's interesting about this story too, from a sociological point of view, is that also shows the usurpation of a civilized world over the use of human sacrifice, something that was very common, as we had talked about at the very beginning of this, now was seen as something that was disgusting and something that the gods resented rather than wanted. So we can see as we go along how culture will influence past stories. So now something that was a part of a ritual involving human sacrifices to the wolf god, if you will, now is seen something that something to be something that's so bestial that it's not worthy part of our human civilization anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. Human sacrifice was something that for thousands and thousands of years was comparatively common. Now the thing is that depending on the culture that you were in, sometimes the people you would sacrifice would be volunteers. There were various cults that actually had people who were raised to be sacrifices. There were cults in which you took enemies, you took prisoners and used them, or you took captives who were from other wars. But it was comparatively common at that time, and of course, as we became more civilized, the idea of human sacrifice became more and more distasteful. But there was a point at which it was not considered uncommon. There's references to human sacrifice in the Bible, in several instances. And what's interesting, even when you read those references, is that they're not portrayed as unusual, even if they're portrayed as distasteful. It's that again. Our belief that we were rising above the idea of eating the flesh of another human being, because we've always told ourselves that, again, we are better than or greater than animals. And by the way, just to make it really clear, since we're talking about it, obviously nobody here is suggesting human sacrifice is a good thing. We think today, I'm saying pretty confident we could say that human sacrifice is neither a good thing nor a healthy thing, but only trying
for sure.
That there was a point in human history where to us it wasn't considered particularly unusual or even particularly distasteful, and that as civilization grew, it was a slow transfer to come to the point that killing and especially consuming another human being was somehow against the nature of man, the better nature of man.
Right. And the consumption of human beings, even in funeral rituals, lasted up in some cases the 1920s, 1930s in some parts of the world.
Oh, there absolutely are still places where, or not places, but circumstances where some form of consuming either the body of an enemy or of a loved one or something like that is a way to take their spirit into you. And there's in vampire folklore, and this is something we're not going to get too deep into tonight, but in vampire folklore, even here in New England, as recently as the late 1800s, we had people who would burn the corpses of suspected vampires, and if they felt that they were infected, by ingesting the ashes of the deceased person, it was believed to act almost like an inoculation against the vampire curse. And while that's a very different subject, it certainly suggests that in a very late period of history here, even in America, that some form of consuming the ashes of the dead was not considered completely crazy. I mean, obviously there are plenty of people who thought it was crazy even back then, but some people thought it was sensible enough if it was going to cure you of vampirism.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if we think about back to the Trojan War, we do see human sacrifice taking place in the Trojan War, and that was something that caused, whenever Iphigenia was sacrificed by her father, that was kind of like the time the gods rallied against it. So, but you still see that there was still that holdover of human sacrifices, even into a time in Greek culture that it was very structured, very regimented, and also very militaristic as well too. We still see that not completely given up even at that time. We're talking about 1084 BC.
And it's around that time that Christianization of civilization was beginning to really take hold in a lot of European countries as well. 900, 1000 around the time you have. Lycanthropy, this shape-shifting concept, spreading kind of ahead of the wave of Christianization. The Christianization of society, among other things, stripped a lot of old magical beliefs, or at least tried to suppress it. But in the 1200s, there was a woman by the name of Marie of France, and she wrote a poem called The Lay of Bisclaveret. Now, Bisclaveret is apparently an old Breton term, which is similar in meaning to werewolf. And this was a time when old pagan beliefs still existed in a kind of a suppressed form in Christian societies. And it's an interesting period because there was a kind of a phase of werewolf belief where the heroic or noble werewolf still existed in some stratas of society. And Marie of France wrote this story. I think I have a little illustration here. Of a werewolf called Bisclaveret. And this werewolf was a noble knight in service to the king. And every week for a couple of days, he would disappear into the forest and he would go hunting in the form of a wolf. There's never any explanation in the poem for why he was either cursed or blessed with the ability to turn into a wolf, but every few days he would disappear into the forest, hunt for a while, and then come back. And this is the one thing that he never told his wife about. He had this wife that he loved very, very much, and she became distressed because he never would tell her where he would disappear for days at a time. So one day when he came back from hunting, his wife confronts him and says, if you truly love me, you wouldn't keep secrets from me. And so you need to tell me this one secret. If you won't tell me your secret and you don't trust me as your wife, then I can't believe you truly love me. And he loved her so much, he finally confessed his secret to her, that he became a wolf a couple of nights a week. And he said, if you ever tell anyone, they'll destroy me. So you please have to keep my secret. I know I do. I love you. I trust you. Just keep my secret. And she said, well, when you go out roaming in the forest as a wolf, do you wear your clothes or do you go naked? And he said, well, obviously I take my clothes off and I hide them. Please don't ask me where I hide them, because if I ever lost my clothes, I'd never be able to return to my human form. And she said, well, clearly you don't trust me then. If you won't tell me where you hide your clothes, then obviously you don't truly love me. So once again, he's pressured and tells her where he keeps her clothes. The next time he runs off into the woods, she, who has sort of stewed over this story, believes that she can't possibly love a man who's a beast half of the time. And so she makes a deal with another knight who had long fancied her, and says, if you steal my husband's clothes, I'll give myself to you and become your wife. So he goes off into the woods. He steals the werewolf's clothes. The werewolf is never able to change back into human form. The knight's duplicitous wife and the new knight both get married, hopefully to be have happily ever after. So months go by, and the king is out hunting in the forest with his retinue, and this enormous wolf comes flying out of the brush, and they chase it and they chase it. And when the wolf is basically run to the point of exhaustion and they're about to kill it, the wolf spins around, runs up to the horse of the king, and bows before the king. And the king says, stop, don't kill this animal. It recognizes its king. How could any noble beast like this possibly exist? And the wolf licks the king's boots, and all of a sudden the king is just overjoyed by this magnificent animal, brings it back to his court, and this wolf becomes his good companion. He's always well behaved. He never shows any hostility whatsoever until the king holds a court, and he has all the nobles of the country come to visit the court. And of course, the duplicitous wife and her new husband are among these nobles. As soon as they enter the court, the wolf leaps up from the king's dais, leaps upon the woman, and tears off her nose. It's a crazy story. But in doing so, the king is so shocked by this that he says, my wolf has never raised a finger or a paw to hurt anyone, but he knows that this woman was the former wife of one of his dearest knights, one of his most trusted knights, and that knight disappeared mysteriously. And he just can't help but think that something here is wrong. So he imprisons the woman and her husband and tortures them until he forces them to talk, at which time the wife admits the entire story and and they restore the werewolf's clothes to him, and the werewolf is able to return to his human form and retain his position as one of the king's greatest knights. Now, it's a strange story, and there's a lot more to it. I give you a really brief version of it, but it's an intriguing period because this is a story written in the 1200s, goes back probably hundreds of years earlier than that, in a period where the idea of transforming into an animal should be considered to be witchcraft and evil, and yet this knight is portrayed as the hero of the story. He's this magical creature who transforms into a wolf, hunts in the forest, and yet becomes the hero of the story. And it's been translated into, there's a version of this story in Le Morte d'Arthur, Mallory's great book of the legend of King Arthur, where the knight is one of King Arthur's knights who's betrayed by his wife, but is a werewolf by night. And so it's a fascinating period in history where they hadn't quite figured out where the werewolf had fallen into the sort of realm of mythical beasts.
Right around the same time in Italy, we have the great story of Saint Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio. You're familiar with that one as well?
I don't think I am, actually. Please tell me.
Well, it is along those lines, but the wolf is very generic. It doesn't really have these kind of human factors to it. But what is going on is there's a wolf that's predating the outskirts. First, it starts on the cattle and the livestock, and then it turns its attention towards the countrymen themselves. And as it happens, Saint Francis comes through. And they plead with Saint Francis, we have to get rid of this wolf. They start comparing it to, some sort of demonic plague going on. And Francis says, hold on a second, I will speak to the wolf. So the wolf comes to him, recognizes that he is indeed a holy man, bows to him the same way that the knight did as well, too, to the king. And they embrace each other. And Francis has a very intelligent conversation with the wolf, stating that the townspeople will feed the wolf in exchange that he simply leaves the people alone and the livestock alone. So they make this kind of symbiotic agreement where the wolf does his little thing and the townspeople do their thing, and they kind of feed him. But as the story goes, that after the wolf dies, it is then interred under the altar of Gubbio itself. And I find it very interesting because at this particular time and place, it was very hard, if not impossible, to have an unbaptized baby buried in the churchyard, So I had always thought, in a lot of these artistic representations that you see of the Wolf of Gubbio, it is often seen as bipedal if it's on two legs. And there's a discourse with St. Francis to seem to suggest that this was more than a simple wolf. So I think that is one of the things. Again, we're talking about these two stories were maybe only 50 years apart. And of course, I believe because this was a period of right whenever the Renaissance was starting to begin in certain areas, that they were drawing upon traditions of the past. But I've always found that very interesting. And as the legend goes, whenever they did, excavate the Church of Gubbio, they did find the skeleton of a wolf underneath the altar.
It's interesting. You talk about the bipedal depiction. There's a sainted dog. There's an actual sainted dog who is often depicted as a knight or as a bipedal creature in order to explain the fact that they sainted an animal. And these images that are up right now are of something called kinocephali. And this is a really interesting old medieval concept. We went through a period, well, honestly, I think humans have always been this way, in which we think of people from foreign countries as very other, very strange. And it's hard sometimes for us to find connections with people whose cultures are very, very different than ours. And going back as far as at least Marco Polo, when he was exploring the world, there were these people who supposedly lived in these remote portions of the world called kinocephali. Kinocephali literally means dog heads. And people have suggested, anthropologists have suggested that simply means that these people lived in a bestial way, that they were so uncivilized to seem beast-like to travelers. But every time they've been depicted in medieval folklore, they're always literally depicted as men with the heads of wolves or dogs. And interestingly enough, in this image that I have up on screen right now, the image it's on the right with these two sainted beings, the wolf-headed creature is Saint Christopher. And the story of Saint Christopher is goes back obviously thousands of years, but the belief that Saint Christopher was one of these kenocephali, that he was a man who lived as a beast, and that when of course we know in the Christian legend of Saint Christopher that he bore the Christ child on his shoulders to walk him across a river, and that in doing so that he obtained sainthood. But there's an older version of this legend that believes that Saint Christopher was this savage, bestial creature, and that when he encountered the Christ child, that the grace of Christ brought him out of his bestial nature and returned him to his human form. And the Catholic Church has actually banned any depictions of Saint Christopher in this beast-like form, but you can find these old icons like the one that in the image here, and there's actually quite a few of them that depict Saint Christopher as a wolf-headed man. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. Absolutely. The Eastern Orthodox Church actually took hold of that, and that's what we get all these great icons for. But I'll tell you what, in the Latin tradition, they did not completely remove the idea that Christopher was some sort of animal, because in the Latin tradition, he was also a giant, yes. And we have all these connotations with a giant as well, too. So whatever the case may be, he was somebody that was outside of the realm of graced humanity, what it is. So the encounter with it, with the Christ child, the person, again, Jeff Hilton asked this great question. I think that we might be hitting pretty close to home on this one. Could the wolf have been a portrayal of the church itself? And I think in many ways you can see that as it's depicted. Especially in marginalia and things of that nature, that there's a predatory type of scourge out there that's loose, and oftentimes the Pope was depicted as being a fox or what have you. But I think there is something to be said about that as well, that this might be a very unique way, especially as the idea is starting to foment about the idea of the church that is seen as some sort of ravenous animal out there among the townsfolk that are pillaging it. And it takes a very holy man to come about and kind of keep that at bay. What is your feelings about that?
I think it actually depended on what side of the fence you fell on, because because obviously in the Christianization of Europe, the Christians frequently depicted the devil and his minions in wolfish ways, and that's something that's going to come up in a story we'll tell in a little while that I'm kind of looking forward to. But so yes, I think that the pagan early Europeans probably saw the church in a very, very savage and predatory way. I don't know if they would necessarily have thought to depict the church in a wolfish way. Maybe because those cultures still had more respect for wild beasts than the Christian side did. But certainly, it's a fascinating idea, and I think that the idea of depicting the wolf in general as the other and as the encroaching force, the darkness basically encroaching upon your world, is very, very common. So it's not unreasonable to think that may have been the case. I was going to talk about a little bit the fact that about the time of the Christianization of Europe, slowly within the Viking culture, that we have a shapeshifter that's a very, very big part. Now, I think almost everybody has heard of berserkers. Berserker literally means bare shirted. These warriors among the Viking cultures, talking about around 800, 900 AD, who would wear animal skins to go into battle. They would paint their faces, and they would take on the ferocity. And these berserkers, these enormous men, supposedly some of the greatest warriors in Viking culture. But there were others called Ulfsarks or Ulfhednar. Ulfsark meaning wolf shirt, Ulfhednar meaning wolf skins, and they were the same. They were very much warriors. They tended obviously not to be the huge, massive, hulking warriors as the berserkers were, but the more clever, the more insidious, the faster, the sleeker, and they would wear these wolf skins to carry them into battle. And so the wolf, of course, remains a huge part of old Viking and Norse mythology. And again, you have this era of the the transition of a wolf from a noble or desirable creature to becoming villainous. Obviously, if you were a Christian monk in Ireland or in England, and these wolf and bear-skinned warriors were bearing down on you, pardon the pun, you'd
Yeah.
consider them pretty darn evil. And so, from the Christian perspective, the ravening wolves and bears of the North were a terrifying image.
Right, and they were also called the drinkers of blood as well in a lot of the contemporary accounts. So you can see what extremes that they would go to, and the idea. Now that's something that we're going to get into pretty soon as well too. But the idea of having some sort of piece or some sort of material from the animal is very important. Not only in the development of later werewolf mythology, but even whenever you think about the one of the most classic dogmen in history, if you will, is that of Anubis in Egypt,
Of course.
and that particular cult had a skin called the imiot that they would carry around, and this skin was a way for the priests of that particular belief system to come in contact with that god, as if that was allowing them to have the god transfer its power into them. So we can see even from and this happens, you start seeing the development of this in a religious sense from the Old Kingdom. So we're going probably back in the oral tradition, at least 2,000 years longer, before that. So we're talking about before the time of Stonehenge. People are thinking that the idea of having a piece of the wolf or the piece of this animal will help you in transforming oneself, at least mentally, into that animal.
It's funny that these two schools of magic, the imitative and sympathetic magic, do date back to the very, very earliest origins of sort of thinking mankind, sentient mankind. But they have carried with us not just through the Egyptian cultures and the Hittites, the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Romans, into the Celtic cultures, but they've carried us right through to today. We still actually have these ideas that a physical connection to something holds power. I mean, the truth is that as ridiculous as it sounds, this is why something like an autograph or a piece of memorabilia, when something, an old place that you loved is destroyed and you want to take home a stone from it, or you get an autograph from a celebrity, these things that connect us to them make us feel empowered. And so that concept of sympathetic magic, the connection between a physical item and its origin, is as powerful to us today as it was 5,000 years ago.
Absolutely. So the wearing of a wolf's garment can make you either a holy man or somebody that would kill your enemy and drink their blood.
There's an interesting sort of a crossover in Ireland. Now, Ireland hasn't had wolves for a very long time, but there is some interesting Irish werewolf folklore. And there's a great story about Saint Patrick. And Saint Patrick, when he was trying to, or Patricius was trying to bring the word of the Christian church to Ireland, and encountered a village full of people who not only were completely resistant to his word, but when he approached them and tried to speak to them about the word of God, that they openly mocked him and they howled at him to sort of drown him out, so that he couldn't even preach to them. And St. Patrick supposed to have been so angered and so offended by this that he called upon the power of God to turn the men of this village into wolves, and they all then descended upon their leader and devoured him. And this is supposedly the origin of the Irish werewolf. Again, it's a piece of folklore that you don't hear a lot, but if you hunt it down, again, pardon the pun, or the turn of phrase there, but is a really strange little chapter from Patrick's history. But there's an interesting flip side to this story, which is that there's also a story about a priest who is basically wandering, spreading the word of God and doing his missionary work, when an enormous gray wolf approaches him. And at first he's terrified. He has no weapons and he assumes this wolf is going to devour him. But the wolf approaches him and speaks to him. And he is mortified. He doesn't know what this means, but he realizes that this must be a werewolf. And the wolf pleads with the priest to come with him. And he approaches a little glade, and under some bushes, he sees that there is a female wolf laying in the bushes. And this female wolf is the mate of the werewolf, and she's been grievously injured and is on the brink of death. And so the werewolf has asked the priest to come here to give her the last rites and actually administer the holy sacrament to her. And it's a fascinating story because the priest does it. He can't let a soul, go into purgatory unblessed, and so actually gives the sacred sacrament to this werewolf. So it's a fascinating story, and it's one that I think any modern theologian would tell you that that's insane, the idea of giving a beast the holy sacrament. But this priest obviously felt that the human soul existed within this werewolf. And so you have these two very, very distinctly different ideas. One is that cursing people to be sort of shafted from the sight of God by turning them into wolves, and the other, a priest who believed that a wolf could still have its soul saved.
Or to be buried in a church, like in St. Francis's case as well, too. So as we are nearing this is just zoomed by, let's just talk about a couple really famous werewolves in history in the last 15 minutes, because I want to get up to modern times before we wrap this up, because I think it's so interesting to see how werewolves exist in the 21st century. So let's talk about some of your favorite werewolf serial killers in history.
Well, definitely, you have the Werewolf of Bedburg. In the late 1500s, you had Peter Stube, or Stump, depending on who you ask, or the spelling at the time, which wasn't really consistent, who was supposed to have ravened through the countryside. We'll kind of zoom in a little bit here, and I'll show you in this image is actually a medieval image, and you have a sort of a montage. And here we have an image of Peter Stube, the werewolf, ravening through the country. Again, a bipedal wolf-headed man. Here's a image of him preying on somebody. But they did eventually track this werewolf down. They discovered who he was, and in doing so, they tortured him. They chopped off his head. They tore chunks of flesh, and they finally actually burned him. But you even see in here, if you look at the top there, they placed his head atop a pike with a carved wooden wolf, and they made it quite a holiday to destroy this werewolf who had been ravening across the countryside. And what's interesting about the story of Peter Stube, like some of the other ones we're going to discuss here, is that he was definitely a real person, and the trial really happened. These are all historic events. Was he physically a werewolf? Did he really transform into a wolf, or was he a serial killer? That's not something that I'm able to answer, but it's a fascinating story, and one that gave rise, this was in Bedburg, which is Germany, to this 16th and 17th century fear of werewolves all across Europe. Now, another in France in the early 1600s, around 1603 or so, was a young boy by the name of Jean Grenier. I'm sorry, I don't speak French, but his story was intriguing because he claimed he was only 13 years old. He was a very, very sort of a poor, destitute young man, probably orphaned at that point. But he claimed that in the woods, he met a man that he called the forest master, or the master of the forest, who gave him a wolf skin and transformed him into a wolf. But the forest master, who is probably sort of an analog of the devil, would also take on the form of the wolf. So this enormous adult wolf and this young adolescent wolf ravaged the countryside, devouring people. But the strange thing about Jean Grenier's story is that he's the one who told everyone he was a werewolf. He approached shepherds in the field, usually young girls, and said, "I'm a werewolf. I'm the one who's been devouring the sheep and devouring the people who've disappeared from the village. And if you aren't kind to me, I'll devour you too." And it is true that the area was plagued by wolves at that time, and so people began to believe that he was on the level. His face was always filthy. He was gaunt. He had these claw-like nails. He was incredibly savage looking. And so eventually he was brought to trial. Now, the trial records for Jean Grenier still exist to this day, but because it was believed that he was seduced by the devil and he was so young at the time, instead of executing them, which would have been a very common answer, what they did is they banished him to a monastery. He was imprisoned in a monastery where he lived out the rest of his life. And he didn't live that long, maybe another 10 or 15 years, but always remained completely savage. He never killed again. He was treated kindly by the monks, but he always remained this savage wolf child. And the wolf child or wolf boy image is something that's not all that uncommon even in modern folklore.
Well, go ahead.
If you carry that forward, however, about another 75 or 80 years, you get into one of the most unique werewolf trials in history. And I know this is one that you're very familiar with, and that was Old Thys or Old Thys. And this was a man in Livonia, which is modern day Estonia, effectively. Now, this man was actually a witness at a trial for livestock theft. And while he was waiting to testify, another villager said to the judge presiding over the trial, "Why is old Thies here? This is a man who you can't trust because everybody knows he's a werewolf." And the judge said, "What exactly are you talking about?" And he said, "Everybody knows. It's common knowledge in the village that Thies is a werewolf." So the judge said to this old man, who's probably in his 70s at the time, he said, "So what's the deal? Why do people think you're a werewolf?" And Thies, rather than saying that's crazy, he said, "Of course I'm a werewolf." And immediately they said, "Well, if you're admitting to being a werewolf, we're going to try you. We're going to put you on trial for it as well." Now, this trial did not go according to plan because they said, "So when did you sell your soul to the devil? When did the devil give you the power to turn into a wolf?" And Thies said, "Oh no, you got this all wrong. I'm actually in the service of God. I am one of a pack of werewolves. We are the hounds of God. And that's our job to travel into the underworld every year at the turning of the season to battle the devil and his witches and win back the bounty of the harvest, win back basically the bounty of the land." And they tried and they tried and they pressed him to admit that he was a servant of the devil, and he insisted that he was a servant of God, granted the magical power by God to turn into a werewolf to battle the devil. And in the end, because the legal requirements for a trial of this kind, where you had to either get an admission by the defendant or you had to get an eyewitness who claimed they witnessed it, they couldn't get either of those, and so they simply this self-admitted werewolf was sentenced to 10 lashes for idolatry and sent on his way. One of the most extraordinary werewolf trials in history.
Yeah, what's so cool about that story too is it happened in 1692, the same time that the Salem witch trials were going on.
It did. It very much
Yeah.
did. And so at the time that Europe's sort of heresy trials and their witchcraft and werewolf trials were just beginning to wind down, we had the very beginning of our heresy and witchcraft trials here in the United
Yeah.
States. So it's an interesting sort of transition in history. Of course, even witches in the United States were accused of being able to transform themselves into animals.
So why do you think that we don't have as much of a tradition of werewolves in America? I mean, we have the idea of the dogman that's been whispered about, and we have the idea of the Beast of Bray Road, which is kind of a new kid on the block. So what is your feelings about that? Even indigenous cultures have the idea of tutelary spirits protecting certain areas, but these are protective spirits. Do you think the reason why we don't have such a tradition is because, the wolves didn't play such a vital part in the New World as it did in the Old World?
I think it's very much the fact that about the time that we were colonizing the Europeans were colonizing America, that the werewolf superstition was already beginning to die out in Europe, and so we didn't necessarily bring that with us. Although obviously we were still pretty hot on the trail of witches by the time we got here. The werewolf fervor that had once existed among European populace had dwindled quite a lot, and I think it was what we would call the dawn of the age of reason. It may not have seemed that way the way we behaved when we got here, but it was the dawn of the age of reason, and we believed that we were capable, and we did our best to subjugate nature when we got here. We basically beat back what we considered to be the savages. And although it's true that Native Americans have a great deal of shape-shifting folklore, it wasn't something that was any longer a significant part of who we were. We kept our werewolves. At that point, we were just about to launch into a new era of werewolf sort of fascination, and that was with the Gothic werewolf. And of course, in the and early 1900s, we began to get the birth of the Gothic werewolf, the fictional werewolf. werewolf. And that's when Wagner the Werewolf, White Fell, The Werewolf by Clemens Hausman, these early Gothic stories that appeared especially in the early 18 and mid 1800s, became more popular. And we began at that point to sort of define a little bit more what we believed a werewolf to be. The Hellhound of West Virginia, very old tale dating back to the first settlers in the area. Now, I don't know that specific one, but Jeff, I'm going to look that up and see if we can get a little. Now, I don't know, Ron, if you know anything about the Hellhound of West Virginia.
Well, because we have such a limited show, because a werewolf show, this could go on for hours, and
we could do a 2-hour show easily. Yes.
And we didn't discuss anything about the Church Grim, which has some sort of connection with the werewolf legends as well too. But the Hellhound is kind of like what we would find over in the European folklore. That this is something that's haunting the wastelands, and it is definitely an opponent to the civilized world, kind of like what you had there with the two werewolves that attacked the churches, in that famous story. But again, we would go on to that, and then we would miss getting up to the 21st century, where we need to end at the 21st century, because the show has to go full circle, my friend.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say that in the 20th century, we had the dawn of cinema, and that's when the werewolf kind of reintroduced itself to the modern world. We had some of the earliest werewolf movies in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 50s, such as The Wolf Man with Claude Rains, Lon Chaney Jr., and this was the story that essentially changed our perception of werewolves forever. Now, prior to the dawn of the cinematic werewolf, we had werewolves who were changed by magic, who were changed by pacts with the devil, Faustian pacts. They were cursed by being born at the wrong time of the year, drinking water out of a wolf's footprint. The folklore of werewolves was complicated, and it was all over the place. But a German writer of all things, named Kurt Siodmak in 1931 or 1941, I apologize, wrote the script for The Wolf Man. And The Wolf Man gave us some of the very first glimpses into things like silver as a way to destroy a werewolf. Now, silver and the full moon don't necessarily have a big part in real werewolf folklore, with one small exception. In the story, which we didn't get into tonight, but The Beast of Gévaudan, a French werewolf story from the 1770s or so, it was said in some folklore, and we don't know if there's any truth to this, that the man who eventually shot this beast, which had savaged the country for 3 years, was felled by a silver button. He pulled a silver button off his jacket, stuffed it into his musket, and he finally felled this beast, which seemed unkillable. And that little presence of silver may have influenced Kurt Siodmak with the idea that silver was the way to kill a werewolf. And a few years later, when the film Frankenstein Meets the Wolf Man premiered, they changed that and actually made the full moon responsible for the werewolf's transformation. Now, in the original movie, The Wolf Man, there's a little poem which they claim is an ancient piece of folklore, but it's not. It was written by Siodmak. Even a man who's pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. Several years later, they made Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and they needed a better system for giving the werewolf a reason to change. So they changed that very slightly and made it even a man who's pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the moon is full and bright. And that small change changed werewolf folklore forever. And since that time, we've believed that the full moon is responsible for a werewolf's transformation. And Kurt Siodmak himself said that the reason that he liked the full moon is because the full silver moon seemed to connect to silver, this metal that was the werewolf's both strength and weakness. So fascinating to think that this little bit of folklore has grown into sort of the heart of the werewolf belief. Being bitten by a werewolf never had anything to do with it. But no, it's the werewolf folklore has evolved, but it's kind of settled in, and we all feel like we know exactly what a werewolf is now. Now, there's one great story, of course, Little Red Riding Hood, which has been interpreted in movie after movie, and that's a story that goes back several hundred years, which is in its at its core a werewolf story. And werewolf stories have evolved and continue to evolve, and something that's happened in more recent years, and this is something that I love, is some recent films that actually bring werewolves back to their folklore roots. And so 2 very recent films that I can recommend if you are a fan, if you're looking for this kind of thing, would be the animated film Wolfwalkers, which is set in Ireland during the time of Oliver Cromwell's rule. And concerns a pagan tribe of wolf shapeshifters trying to survive as the Christianization and the destruction of their forest happens. It's a magnificent animated film. It's literally a visual work of art, one I highly recommend. And then just a month or so ago, a film called Cursed, set in France in the 1800s, which also uses some really classic old folklore about magic. It does bring silver into the mix, but it's a fascinating story. Unfortunately, not doing terribly well in theaters. People don't love period pieces so much these days, but those are two excellent folkloric interpretations of the werewolf that I can highly recommend if you're in the mood for that kind of thing, especially as we get into March here and St. Patrick's Day is coming on. I certainly recommend Wolfwalkers.
This blew by, my friend.
It did. That was a fast hour. We blew through a lot of subjects, folks. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer more questions. We'll get better at that as time goes on. I hope you guys enjoyed some of the things we spoke about tonight.
I did too. I hope they enjoyed themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we have a good handful of people who've been watching us this evening. Of course, this will be available on YouTube a little bit later this evening. So, folks, want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. Ron, thank you for being an awesome co-host and bouncing off these ideas. And before we go, if you want to put up any information about how people can track down your books, I'm going to run a quick banner here. If anybody's interested, I tend to write about monsters and folklore through my website, which is ghostboypress.com. If anybody's interested,
I didn't do any of that fun stuff, so you just have to write it down. Just look up Ron Murphy on Amazon. That's all I ask you.
Fair enough. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, I want to thank you again so much for joining us tonight. You're awesome. And hopefully we'll see you next week when we will be discussing yet another great monster from history.